James Hewitt writes, "God did not save us to be a sensation. God saved us to be servants." Today's gospel reading provides a remarkable contrast between sensation and servant. In this reading, we hear the story of two of Jesus' disciples, James and John, who make the request to Jesus to receive a position of prominence in the kingdom. "Let one of us sit at your right and one at your left in glory," they ask of Jesus. The disciples' impudence and lack of understanding is beyond belief. How could two people who are so close to Jesus miss the boat so completely? Did they forget the encounter with the rich man that occurred just before their request, or the encounter with the little children? And have they not heard Jesus' own prediction of what was soon to happen to him? In light of all of this, their request is truly astounding. And it angers their fellow disciples. But what seems to anger the other disciples is not so much that James and John have misunderstood Jesus' teachings, which perhaps could be justified, but that James and John went to Jesus requesting a place of power ahead of the rest of them. The other disciples do not seem to be acting out of righteous indignation. Rather, it appears that they are jealous. And Jesus' loving response to them all is to take the opportunity to contrast earthly greatness with divine greatness. Earthly greatness is defined as having power over, whereas divine greatness is defined as being servant to. Today, there are examples all around us of the secular quest for greatness and its often accompanying spectacular fall. Bernie Madoff is an obvious example of the quest for monetary power, but our country's growing credit card debt hints at how widespread the problem is. In contrast to worldly greatness, to be great in God's eyes is to be a servant modeled after Jesus' own life of service. For many listeners, the story of James and John is disconcerting because if James and John, who knew Jesus personally, couldn't incorporate his teachings into their own lives, how on earth are we to do so? These stories are a reminder for many of us that, try as we might, all too often our actions are more reflective of motivations of the secular world than the divine. So how do we become better servants? One way is by making sure that the motivation for our service is love. 18th century Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Secker, said, "God has three sorts of servants in the world. Some are slaves and serve him from fear. Others are hirelings and serve for wages. And the last ones are sons and daughters who serve because they love." In the week ahead, as you seek to serve God, check your motivation. Divine servanthood is always motivated by love. Another way to become better servants is by being mindful of who it is that calls us to serve. We should remember that in all things we serve God and God alone. By becoming more aware of God's presence in everyday life, we can strive to understand that all we do is somehow of God. With this approach, even the most mundane tasks that might not usually be associated with our spiritual lives can be viewed as service. One young mother recalls her difficult transition from paid employment to being a stay-at-home mother after the birth of her first child. A spiritual director assisted her in the process, instructing her to walk with the baby each day, being acutely aware of her surroundings, and being alert to where God might be. She recalls seeing nature in the created order as well as the frenetic pace of those around her in a new way during these walks. She also began to see her tasks, such as the endless piles of laundry that had to be washed, as a service of love. A third way to become better servants is by ensuring that our church is a servant church. Theologian Karl Barth discusses such churches in his book, Dogmatics in Outline. Barth describes the living church as one that proclaims the gospel to every creature. The church runs like a herald to deliver the message. It is not a snail that carries its little house on its back and is so well off in it that only now and then it sticks out its feelers and then thinks that the claim of publicity has been satisfied. No, the church lives by its commission as herald. Where the church is living, it must ask itself whether it is serving this commission or whether it is a purpose in itself. Is your congregation a living servant church? Does it have a clear understanding that it exists to service to Jesus? Do all actions stem from Jesus' commission to proclaim the gospel? Do worship services, community outreach, and activities all have the possibility to transform those they touch? If not, then perhaps it might be the time to begin a conversation about refocusing on Christ's divine purpose for your congregation. Because after all, the mission of the church is the mission of Jesus Christ. The story of James and John is disconcerting because even the most pious listeners can see a bit of themselves in the story. How many of us are able to truly base our lives and actions on the divine definitions of greatness, servanthood? Fortunately, this story closes with a message of hope. Jesus proclaims that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Jesus promises us that although we will all fall short, through his death, we are redeemed. And that is the good news. Amen.